Welcome, Duke alumni and friends, to this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute, which is an interdisciplinary educational program organized into a set of thematic courses. And our theme today is Be Well Together. I'm Molly Weeks. I'm a Duke alum, PhD 2013, and I currently serve as the Director of Research in the Office of Undergraduate Education here at Duke. And my research focuses on the diverse processes that contribute to student success in childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, with a particular focus on the college years. And students' feelings of loneliness and belonging within that frame have long been a central focus of my work. So I'm really looking forward to a stimulating discussion today and hearing from all of you as well. So thanks very much for joining our program today, which is Understanding and Combating the Loneliness Epidemic. This program is part of our theme, Be Well Together, which will explore the social dimensions of health and wellness, focusing on the critical role of loneliness, finding balance with social media, intergenerational connections, and my favorite, healthy relationships. Today's program is the first session in the Be Well Together series, and we'll be discussing the impacts of loneliness and how to build meaningful connections, reduce isolation, and foster a strong sense of community. And we'll have a presentation at the beginning and then have a Q&A session at the end. So please put your questions in the chat. And we'll have time for discussion at the end. Joining us today is Dr. Briana Brownlow, Assistant Professor in Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and a clinical psychologist at Duke Medical Center. Dr. Brownlow splits her time between research, education, and clinical work on both the inpatient and the outpatient level, with a focus on providing trauma-informed and culturally responsive clinical care. Dr. Brownlow's research broadly focuses on how racism gets under the skin and impacts Black Americans' physical and mental health. And so we're delighted to have Dr. Brownlow join us today. Welcome to the Forever Learning Institute, Dr. Brownlow.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate the warm welcome. Really excited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can jump right in. So again, Dr. Brownlow, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and assistant professor here at Duke. I also did my clinical psych residency at Duke, so I've been here for almost 4 years now. So excited to be a part of the Duke family and to talk a little bit today about how do we understand and address loneliness, especially in such a disconnected world. So with that being said, setting the agenda for today. So we'll talk a little bit about framing what is the loneliness epidemic, really kind of contextualizing that for everybody. And then I'll spend the bulk of my time talking about what are the roots of loneliness, so what causes loneliness, how does it impact us, and how do we go about combating loneliness. And then we'll hopefully have some time at the end for takeaways and any questions that might come up for you all. All right. So before I even jump into talking about and framing the loneliness epidemic, I want to actually kind of take the pulse of those in the room today. So, and in true psychologist form, we always start with assessment. And so getting a sense of what are we feeling as far as our own versions of loneliness or social connection. And so this is just a 3-question scale that helps us to kind of take a pulse on where are we as far as our level of disconnectedness or connectedness in our social worlds. So I'll ask 3 questions, and you don't have to drop it in the chat unless you just really, really want to. More so take a mental note. So if you have paper to write down your number, or if you can keep those numbers in your head, we'll all just kind of take a mental note of where we're falling. So for each question, if it's hardly ever, you're going to give yourself a 1. If it's some of the time, 2. And if it's often for you, it's 3. So question number 1. How often do you feel that you lack companionship? So hardly ever, some of the time, or often. Question number 2. How often do you feel left out? 1, hardly ever. 2, some of the time. Or 3, often. And then last but not least, how often do you feel isolated from others? Hardly ever, some of the time, or often. So hopefully all of us either wrote the numbers down or took a mental note, and we're really good at doing math. So you're just going to combine those 3 numbers that you wrote down for yourself. And we'll kind of look at where do we fall across the spectrum of loneliness. So from 3 being the least lonely to 9 being the most lonely. Again, no pressure to drop it in the chat. More so this is an individual check-in, right? But thinking about where do we fall? Chances are, given that loneliness is an epidemic on a national and a global scale, we probably have some variability here, right? With people falling across the spectrum of least to most lonely. But either way, wanting to kind of take stock of where are you as an individual, so that as we kind of talk through both the causes of loneliness and how we actually go about combating it, that hopefully there will be things that are personally relevant for wherever you might be on this scale. So that being said, chances are there's some of us who are in here who are feeling some level of loneliness, and that's both expected and normal, given that about half of US adults report experiencing some level of loneliness, with the highest rates being among young adults, particularly those between 19 to 30 years old, with the highest rates of loneliness being for Generation Z, so our Gen Z folks. And so we know that this is something that for most people we can connect to. And even on a global scale, we're seeing this loneliness epidemic with a good amount of people saying that they feel more disconnected from others than they have in previous generations. We know that during the pandemic, we saw an increase in loneliness, particularly for older adults, where 60% of men over 65 were saying that they were more lonely now than they were before the pandemic, and 71% of women over 65 saying that they're more lonely now than before the pandemic. And I'll talk a little bit more about how the pandemic contributed to the loneliness epidemic, but it's important to note that even that statistic about half of the US experiencing some level of loneliness was even before the pandemic had started, right? And so we know these numbers have increased across time. And when we zoom in a little bit more and think about disparities in loneliness, there are important groups to kind of highlight here. One is that people from underrepresented racial groups are reporting that they're more likely to be lonely than those than other racial groups. So with 75% of Hispanic adults reporting loneliness and 68% of Black adults reporting loneliness. We also see disparities when we look at socioeconomic status, with those with lower incomes reporting that they're lonelier than those with higher incomes. So nearly 2/3 of adults who are earning less than $50,000 per year being classified as lonely, and almost 3 in 4 people who receive health benefits through Medicaid, so a federal payer, being classified as lonely as well. And I already mentioned that young adults are more likely to be lonely, but just want to highlight here even further that they're twice as likely to be lonely than senior citizens. And this even accounts for some of the rise in loneliness that we saw, particularly for our older adults during the pandemic. And so it's particularly something where young adults, and we'll kind of talk about all the things that have happened in the world that are contributing to this, but where young adults are more likely to be feeling disconnected from others. All right. So we got a big snapshot of the loneliness epidemic. And so I want to spend most of my time talking about what causes loneliness and how it impacts us. But I'll highlight this in saying, so I'm a clinical psychologist, and I will say, like, the majority of the patients I see have some level of loneliness. Like, even if that's not why they're coming to me, there's something about feeling disconnected from others. And what we know is that when we have social support, it helps us in so many different realms. And so being able to understand what's causing loneliness, what's driving loneliness, helps us to better intervene on it. So thinking about the causes of loneliness, I already named the pandemic as a really big predecessor for the epidemic that we're now facing, where loneliness is being considered a public health crisis, right? And so even our U.S. Attorney General came out with a report about how loneliness is becoming this on a global scale, something that is impacting our morbidity and mortality. And so the pandemic really was kind of this experience that catapulted us further in our disconnection from others. And a big part of that, of course, was when we had our lockdown. For a lot of people, that was kind of where it started, right? So feeling isolated and disconnected from others, out of your routines, out of the spaces that we used to occupy, even the things that we didn't like doing, like going to work, right, were ways in which we were able to have some level of engagement with the world around us, right? And even after the pandemic has shifted in a lot of ways where there's some level of normalcy, there's things that haven't changed, right? That haven't gone back to quote unquote normal. Some of us still work from home or work on Zoom more than ever. Some of us never heard of Zoom, and now we're all Zoom experts. And so a lot of us now are really engaging more in virtual ways. This is particularly true in the realm of psychology. Most of my patients never went back to in-person sessions. I still see about half my patients virtually. Right? And that makes a huge difference in how we connect and understand people's body language. The other thing, though, is that people are less likely to mingle now than they were before. So when we go out, we often are still in our bubbles. and people aren't engaging in the same ways, whether because of their own comfort level or just because we've kind of gotten out of the practice. And those kind of communal spaces have really shifted and we've become more individualized. In line with this, technology and social media is a huge component to the loneliness epidemic. And so, in and of itself, technology and social media actually really helped with connectedness, especially in the beginning. Right? I live in Durham, North Carolina. None of my family lives here. I've always lived in states where I don't have any local family members. And I have a lot of friends who live in different parts of the country and even the world. And technology allows me to connect with them. I can get on FaceTime with my mom, probably more than she'd like, right? And still feel connected to her. And I can be on social media and see what's happening to those around me who I don't get to interact with on a day-to-day basis. So from that perspective, it really has helped us to connect. But what's happened is that the more we've become absorbed and consumed with technology, the more we've actually become disconnected with the world around us, right? And so we've become really, for most of us, spending tons of times looking at screens. And there's been recent work that has shown that not only is social media detrimental for our mental health and our physical health, but it also does something to our biology, right? Where we can scroll and see all these things that give us a quick hit of dopamine, right? Which makes it addictive and reinforcing, but it also makes the real world boring, right? Because we don't get that level of novelty and pleasure that you get from just being able to scroll and see all these things. But the more we scroll, the more absorbed we are, the more disconnected we are from the world around us. And we're often, observing things that give us pleasure, but not doing those same things in our day to day. Right. And so social media also really has increased the ways that we're comparative, right? And so we look at other people and say, look how different they are. Look how much they are happier than me. And that also has increased people's levels of isolation, both internally and externally, right? Where there's all these ways in which now there's expectations and standards for how we move through the world that weren't there before, that make it really hard to engage with the real world and make it much easier to escape to a virtual world, which won't ever be sufficient because naturally we're social beings. We're meant to be in community. Another big component that's caused loneliness is across time, we've worked more and more, right? So work hours have increased, but also the hyperfixation and the hyper value of work has increased. And so more often than not, you'll see people who are spending most of their days working and don't have much to do outside of their work, right? Where in previous generations, people had really rich social lives, right? They'd come home and they'd be in community with folks and have other things that they were doing in their day to day. And now we find that most people are just working and there's limited space even for their ability to connect with others, which can further, augment our experience of loneliness and disconnection from others, especially now that work has become much more insular and isolated. A lot of us now work in silos. Like I mentioned before, since the pandemic, I engage less with those I work with. One day out of the week do I run into my colleagues. And most of us, are kind of doing our day-to-day thing and not really even engaging in workspaces as communal spaces anymore. And then our social infrastructure and urbanization. So when we think about the worlds that we live in, the societies that we live in, our communities, they have really changed across time as we've become more urban and as gentrification has really settled into a lot of our local spaces. And so when we kind of compare decades ago to now, there are much less community-based spaces. So we have less playgrounds, we have less parks, we have less spaces that are dedicated to people just coming together. And even how we think about housing has become more insulated as well, right? Like people don't really know their neighbors. They live in communities where people don't actually engage with those around them and don't have communal spaces where people come to gather together. And as we've thought about being more efficient and getting to places faster, we're often doing that in a way that takes away those broader community spaces and really kind of emphasizes how do I get from one place to another as fast as possible while interacting with the least amount of people as possible. Right. And so even that, like not having to talk to people to get into spaces, but being able to just scan something or pay for something with my phone, all of that serves to create an infrastructure that takes us further away from being societally focused and communally focused. And urbanization is a big part of that because there aren't as many really like environments where people are engaging with each other. And this is particularly true in the United States. There's been recent work that's shown that even how we go about exercising. A lot of people in the United States, they go to gyms and the goal is not to talk to anybody, not to make eye contact. Whereas when in other countries, they're more likely to engage in physical activity that's communal, like dance classes outside or playing soccer or frisbee, things like that, where that's less of an emphasis in our infrastructure as we get more urban and have less green space. And then to that segue, individualism, right? So this is inherently a Eurocentric Western society concept that we emphasize individuality, oftentimes at the expense of collectivism. And so the more that we emphasize individualism, the more likely that we're pulling away from the value that comes from being collectivistic, right? And so that in and of itself can create forms of isolation, particularly in capitalistic societies, when the goal is how do you stand out as an individual, and we think less about how do we come together as communities. I'll talk a little bit more about mental health issues later, right? But we know that mental health has a direct link to loneliness, right? Where when we're struggling with our mental health, we're more likely to isolate. And the more likely we isolate, the more lonely we feel, the worse our mental health. And so that with the rates of mental health worsening across time, but particularly during the pandemic, we know that there's a direct correlation there between loneliness and mental health issues that are on the rise. Another kind of more common phenomenon now is relocation. So if you think maybe about like older adults, older generations, it was much more common to live and die in the same place, right? People really stayed in their local communities. And one benefit of that is oftentimes you had these long-lasting relationships where the friends from elementary school you could continue in adulthood. All of your family was in the same space. But more and more, as the world has become modernized and jobs have kind of spread out in different ways, people are more likely to relocate. And I'm an example of that, right? I've lived in 3 different states and it's much more common. And so that's also why we can point to why young adults in particular are feeling more lonely, because the millennials and Gen Z are more likely to move to go to school, to move for jobs, to move for, different relationships. And then when you move at certain junctures of your life, it is harder to build community and to create roots because there aren't embedded spaces for you to build community, right? When we're in school and we're kids, we inherently know that we're going to meet somebody at school if you go to school in person, and you're probably going to meet somebody at like at the playground, at the park, or in these sports that we do. But at different stages of life, you have less built-in opportunities to create community, especially if you're likely to travel and you're disconnected from your family or your local friends. We've also seen on a national scale a decrease in religiosity. Americans are reporting that they're less religious, and religious spaces served as a huge component for how people made connection, right? And so there's a lot of work that's being done now on how churches are dying. And so that in and of itself is another source of loneliness, where people have less of those kind of built-in community spaces that really were a big driver for social connectedness for many people. And then last but not least, systemic inequity. So I talked earlier about how particular groups are more likely to be at risk for loneliness, and we can point directly to the inequities that we see on a structural and a system level, right? Where if you're experiencing things like marginalization or racism or discrimination, it makes you feel more isolated from others. And I want to talk a little bit more about this, particularly for communities of color, right? Where if oftentimes we know that for some people, you're navigating spaces where maybe you're the only one, or it's less people who you can identify who have things in common with you. And one of the things that we notice, particularly for people of color, but also like LGBTQ folks and other people who are at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities, is they're wearing a mask, right? To be in these spaces where maybe they're the only one, or being spaces where it's not overtly, it might be stigma, or there are ways in which there's not inclusivity there, is what do I want others to see? What do I not want others to see? And we all wear masks, right? Like that's just about how we perform as human beings. But some groups of people are more likely to be incentivized to wear a mask and to be policed in ways where they have to move through spaces like by code switching, right? And so something I will often share when I talk about the mask we wear is, for me, right, as a Black woman in the field that I'm in, I often feel like I want others to see that I should be respected. I want others to see my competence. Or do I not want others to see? At times it's hard to be vulnerable, right? Because I'm already fighting for that level of respect, right? I work in a hospital setting, and oftentimes I have to remind people like, hey, I'm Dr. Brownlow, and they expect that I'm somebody else, right? And so those masks that we wear also serve to isolate us from our humanity, which makes it even harder to connect and makes us feel even more internally disconnected, which can further that chasm between us and other people and cause even more loneliness in the world that we occupy. And this is especially true now when we're seeing so many things happening on a national and a global scale that can make a lot of people feel disconnected. So, that being said, what is the impact of loneliness? How do we think through, now that we talked a little bit about some of the roots of why it's become an epidemic on a global scale, how does loneliness impact us? So I've already alluded to the fact that we are inherently social creatures. From an evolutionary perspective, the humans that survived were the humans that were able to connect with others, who created tribes, who moved in groups. It was the ones who were moving as individuals who often weren't able to survive whatever they were navigating. And so we know that biologically we are meant to be social, which also means that when we are disconnected from others, it has a biological impact for us. So that being said, I'll talk a little bit about physical health. What we know is that loneliness has many ripple effects for our physical health and well-being. The most kind of robust findings that we have in the field around loneliness is particularly in cardiovascular disease, right? Where there's been decades of research that has shown that lacking social connection increases our risk for cardiovascular events. So think like heart disease, stroke, but it also has an indirect effect that when we have less connection to others, we're also less likely to receive support that could be life-saving, right? And so that's kind of going to be a theme throughout, that there's these direct associations, but also indirect. By not having social community, they might say, hey, you need to go to the doctor, or hey, something's wrong and I can call 911 fast. Another big component is hypertension. So this is a little bit of the work that I do. I do work around blood pressure, and we've been able to find associations between those who feel more lonely and hypertension, even in childhood. Right? And so it's kind of a chicken versus the egg as far as the impact of these things. But what we do know is that hypertension and stress go hand in hand, and one of the things that relieves stress is social connection. We also know that hypertension is known as the silent killer for a reason. And when you have less social connection, you're less likely to engage in things that could be helpful for managing your health, but also having people around you who can notice things that are off and get you help faster. Loneliness is also linked to sleep issues, right? So when we feel isolated and disconnected from others, there's also direct associations with like insomnia and difficulty being able to get restful sleep. In the realm of diabetes, social disconnection is related to diabetes, particularly in the realm of management, right? And so you think about like long term, right? If I'm somebody who is experiencing a lot of social disconnection, that can have a ripple effect for my long-term health, right? We talk a little bit about that in a second, but particularly for diabetes is one of those things that's best managed when we have a support system. Right? And so an example that comes to mind for me is I have an uncle who has diabetes, and no matter where we go, his wife, his sister, all of his family is really managing his nutrition. They're like, hey, not too many pieces of cake. And if he was by himself and isolated, he wouldn't have that support system that in some ways is helping to hold him accountable and helping him to manage his diabetes long term and supporting those healthy life choices. We also know that loneliness is related to infectious disease. People who are more isolated tend to have weaker immune systems and be more prone to infectious diseases and worse outcomes. There's also a good amount of work that's come out in the realm of cognitive function, where social isolation has been connected to decreased cognitive function and increased risk for Alzheimer's, dementia, memory-related concerns in later life. And in fact, people who are socially isolated have a 50% chance or 50% more likely to develop dementia later in life. And then weight problems. So this is something where we see this across the lifespan, that lonelier children, lonelier adults tend to have more problems with weight. That's also kind of a chicken versus the egg. We know that folks who experience weight problems often experience stigma and have harder times connecting with others because of that stigma, and are often isolated as a result. And then that can kind of become this cycle of sorts where you feel more lonely, more disconnected from others. And we know that obesity and loneliness have direct associations there too. And then people who are lonely are actually at greater risk for kidney problems. So across all of these realms, being lonelier really has direct consequences for our physical health. And so it's not surprising that when we think about mortality, so our rates, our odds of early death, lacking social connection comes out on top. I don't know about you all, but I remember seeing this a year or so ago and being like very shocked that lacking social connection was a greater risk factor than smoking 15 cigarettes daily or drinking 6 alcoholic drinks daily, physical inactivity, obesity, or air pollution. All things that are much more common risk factors that we might think about, but lacking social connection increased our odds of early death than any of those factors, which speaks to just how important social connection really is, not just for our health, but our longevity. And with that in mind, you're about 50% more likely to survive over the next 7 years if you have social connections. So it doesn't just shorten our lives to be disconnected, it extends our lives to be connected. So I want to talk a little bit about loneliness and mental health, and then I'll wrap up with talking about what are the things we can actually do to address this, given just how drastic the impacts of loneliness can be. So loneliness has this kind of reinforcing cyclical mutual effect with mental health, right? Loneliness often can lead to mental health issues, and mental health issues can often lead to loneliness. And so it kind of serves this reinforcing cycle. And so it has a bidirectional relationship between loneliness and mental health. And particularly the realms where we see loneliness and mental health having strong links are depression, right? And so it's probably not surprising to a lot of people. Oftentimes, one of the hallmarks of depression is that it makes us want to isolate, right? It makes us not want to do anything. People will often say, I just don't want to get out of bed. And we are at greater risk of depression when we already feel disconnected. But even for those who have rich social relationships, when we're depressed, it's hard to connect with our people. We don't feel motivated to do so. We feel low energy, and those things can further cause us to feel isolated. We also know that when we're depressed, we have what we call mood-dependent thoughts. So my mood is often coloring the kinds of thoughts that I have. So I'll have thoughts like, it won't even be that fun, or nobody will miss me, or I'm just gonna be a Debbie Downer. And those thoughts then impact our behaviors and increase the likelihood that we'll disconnect from others, which then makes us feel even worse because now people aren't inviting us and now people aren't talking to us, and it reinforces that narrative and kind of creates this quicksand of depression. And so that's a huge link that we see, similar to anxiety. When we're anxious, right, we often are internally focused, and that can also sever that connection with other people. This is particularly true in the realm of social anxiety, right, where we have these anxious thoughts about how am I coming off? Are people noticing that I'm nervous? And then we're like, maybe I just won't go at all, right? And anxiety goes hand in hand with avoidance, right? It feels better, at least in the short term, to say, I don't really want to do this thing because it makes me nervous. So then I don't. I experience that short-term relief. But in the long term, it reinforces that I'm going to keep avoiding. And that can also further our experience of loneliness and disconnection from others. The other two big realms where loneliness has kind of a significant impact is self-harm and suicidality. And we saw this particularly in the pandemic, that people who are lonelier are more likely to engage in self-harm and more likely to experience suicidal thoughts. And this is especially true for our youth, right? Where there's actually been an increase in suicidality and self-harm for youth, particularly for Black youth. There's the Black youth suicide crisis going on. And one of the things that is a big component of that is people feeling disconnected from their peers. And you can imagine from a developmental perspective, when we're young, particularly adolescence, is a big time when you want to feel that sense of belonging. And to not have it is really detrimental for mental health and can increase the risk that people are more likely to engage in self-harm and suicidality. And we also see this for LGBTQ youth, right? Especially if they're in environments that aren't supportive or that are stigmatizing or isolating, where they have to feel like, to go back to what I said earlier, that they're wearing a mask. And so we know that those populations in particular are at increased risk, and disconnection really drives that risk. And then loneliness and substance use go hand in hand. Often when we're more alone, we're more likely to use substances, especially if that's already a challenge. And substance use in and of itself can be isolating because it requires us to hide, right? Especially if it's severe substance use, right? That's a part of what perpetuates substance use forward is if I hide it and people don't know, then I can kind of continue to engage in these behaviors even when they become harmful. And then trauma-related symptoms. So a lot of the work that I do is on trauma, both in the hospital setting and in the outpatient setting. And what we know is that when we experience trauma, one of the big factors for recovery versus non-recovery is avoidance. And so as you can imagine, when something bad happens, you don't want to talk about it or experience it. And it's very isolating to go through something traumatizing and feel like people don't understand what you're navigating. And loneliness in and of itself can worsen trauma-related symptoms, but social connectedness can actually help recovery from trauma-related symptoms. And so in that way, loneliness can also exacerbate how we recover from traumatic experiences and even things like grief, right? Grief can be an isolator where even when you're surrounded by people, you feel disconnected. And that can further that loneliness and that isolation, both internally and then in consequence externally, right? Pulling away from other people. All right. So that being said, we talked about how loneliness can impact your physical health, your mental health, your longevity. So how do we combat loneliness, particularly in a world where I just told you all the reasons why we're lonely? It makes total sense. And some of those barriers are really hard to navigate. So how do we start to kind of chip away at this rapid social disconnection that we're seeing? All right. So first things first, we acknowledge and explore our feelings. Right. And so again, this is a very psychologist thing to say. But we actually don't really know how to intervene if we don't first explore what's causing the feeling in the first place. So when I notice that I feel disconnected from others, I want to meet that feeling with curiosity, right? Because sometimes what's driving loneliness is grief, right? Other times what's driving loneliness is I don't have anybody around me that feels like-minded. Other times it's physical distance, right? Other times it might be ways in which you felt rejected by the people in your life. And so until we can acknowledge and explore those feelings, it doesn't allow us to really know what the path forward is. And the thing that I've probably noticed the most in my practice for people who are coming and saying, I'm feeling really lonely, is there's this resistance to being alone in the first place, right? People value having social connection, as we should, but sometimes we value it at the expense of devaluing our alone time. And to quote Dr. Seuss, he says, alone, whether we like it or not, alone is something we'll be quite a lot. And some people feel lonely, not necessarily because of their disconnection, but because they don't like to be alone, right? And we avoid feeling alone in ways that also can drive up that distress. And so we want to be able to really acknowledge and explore those feelings so we have a path forward. And so that we can normalize that it's not always fun to be alone. But unfortunately, it's something that we're going to be quite a lot. So we want to figure out how do we have good relationships with ourselves too. One of the big things that we can do to address loneliness is connect and reach out. And it sounds really simple, but oftentimes we particularly get caught up in our day-to-day that we miss opportunities where we can connect with others. And so something that I do a lot, and it's changed things for me, and I read this in a grief book. So I do a lot of grief work. And one of the things that it said is that when we're experiencing things like grief or trauma, we tend to be very internally focused. You see all the ways in which you're different from other people, and it's hard to kind of come outside of your own bubble. And so one small thing that you can do to connect with your humanity and the humanity of others is make eye contact. A lot of us don't make eye contact. And so the goal is make eye contact with as many people as you can and just smile. And it was incredible to see how it shifted my day, to just look people in the eyes and smile. Most people were like, oh, and they would smile back, or they would be like, hi, or how are you? But it made me feel more alive and connected to the world around me rather than walking, like looking at my phone or avoiding eye contact. It reminded me that I'm a part of a fabric in the world, right? We're interconnected. And so that can be a small way that we reach out. Other ways that we can reach out is if we do have people in our lives, when's the last time that you talked to them? Right? Even a small text and saying like, hey, just thinking about you can help us to connect with those around us, particularly when we're feeling disconnected. When's the last time you called a family member that you haven't talked to in a while? Right? And what we know is that a lot of times people who feel lonely often notice the ways that other people are not initiating contact, and it makes it discouraging to initiate. And so being able to take that first step and just create the momentum can be a way to create purposeful and meaningful connections with other people and to deepen them. So how do we reach out? And there's work that actually shows that when we schedule it, we're more likely to do it. So even if it's like once a week, I'm going to call a friend I haven't talked to in a while. And for those who maybe don't like to be on the phone like me, and I'll only give it 30 minutes, right? Or I'm going to send a text to somebody I haven't talked to in a minute. Things like that, we're more likely to be accountable when we schedule it in. Or I'm going to go out for coffee. I'm going to eat lunch outside or eat lunch with another person. Things like that can help us to really bolster those opportunities that we often miss. Important thing is to build healthy relationships. So it's not enough to try to like create connection with anybody and everybody, really it's quality over quantity. Some of us have tons of people that we interact with on a day-to-day, but there's no depth, there's no quality. And so what we really want to do to combat loneliness is not gain a lot of connections, but to build connections of meaning and connections of depth. And vulnerability and authenticity go a long way. So taking stock of, are the relationships that I have right now of quality? Are they healthy? Are they relationships where they lack boundaries? Are there relationships where it feels one-sided, right? Are they relationships where maybe they're in the wrong level, right? So I think they're a close friend, but really maybe they're on a lower level of friendship, right? And so really taking stock of, how do I build healthy relationships? And a lot of that is having relationships where you have something in common and where you have shared values and where it feels reciprocal and mutual. And if that's not the case, some of these other strategies might help for you to find connectedness and build healthier relationships. And one of those things is engaging in activities you enjoy. So this is actually a form of a treatment for depression called behavioral activation, which says that when I'm depressed, it makes me inactive. But if I engage in activities that bring me pleasure or a sense of accomplishment, it can kind of offset that snowball effect of depression. The same is true for loneliness. When I engage in activities I enjoy, one, it gives me positive emotions, which makes it more easy for me to connect with other people, but it also increases the chances that I connect with people who are like-minded, right? So one of the things that I enjoy a lot is music. I like find live music anywhere. I play the piano, and not surprisingly enough, most of my friends are musicians, right? Most of my friends sing because I met them doing the things that I enjoyed, right? And so what are the things that you enjoy doing? How can you actively seek out opportunities to do that, particularly doing that in community? So if you like to dance, taking a dance class. If you like poetry, going to an open mic. If you like cooking, taking a cooking class. So putting yourself in position to meet people that you enjoy and who enjoy doing the same things, have that commonality, but it also makes it easier to then be able to connect. For those of us who maybe struggle to initiate conversation, if we're doing something I enjoy, I can just ask you about what we're doing, which helps to break the ice a little easier than just walking up to a stranger and saying, hey, will you be my friend? Right. And then getting involved in serving. So a lot of what's happened that's created loneliness is we're disconnected from our communities. And so engaging in civic activities and engaging in community service is one way to feel connected more to your humanity, but the humanity of others. That can offset loneliness too, even if you don't build long-term relationships. So serving and getting involved in your local communities is one way to really feel more connected with the world around you. And there's value there. And anytime we engage in behaviors that are aligned with our values, they're much more meaningful and give us purpose. Branch out. So oftentimes to combat loneliness, we have to do something different. We often feel lonely because we're in our day-to-day routines where we don't feel connected to other people. And so branch out could be trying something new, but it could even be something as small as taking a new route, right? And like just trying to find new ways to connect with other people. And so doing things that put you outside of your comfort zone, but particularly put you in context with other people. And that shift maybe the stagnation that often comes with the routine that many of us occupy. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but invest in alone time. If I don't feel at ease when I'm alone with myself, it's going to be harder for me to connect with people in meaningful ways. And so if I'm running from myself to connect with other people, I'm always going to be at a deficit, right? If I'm trying to connect with other people from a space of scarcity, I'm never going to be able to have abundant relationships. And so how do we practice self-care and build our relationship with self so that we're not really moving from a space of, I need to connect with other people because I don't want to be with me? Because then you'll always feel lonely and you'll always feel disconnected. And it will prevent you from knowing who am I like authentically, so that I can create authentic relationships rather than creating relationships just so I can have people in my life. And then more broadly, we want to challenge barriers to connection. Right? And so this on an individual level is, what are the things that get in the way of my connection right now? Is it like I need to unplug and like I'm absorbed in the virtual space that I live in? Is it that when I walk, I don't really keep the conversation going? Right? What are the things that personally for you serve as a barriers to connection? Is it that you often work at home and you maybe want to go to a co-working space? Right? Is it that you live in a community where everything's spread out and you don't see a lot of people on a day-to-day? So taking stock of what are my individual barriers to connection, even if it's thoughts or emotions. Like maybe a barrier to connection is that when you try to connect with other people, your self-talk tells you that they don't like you, right? So what are the things that individually get in the way? And then on a systemic level, what are the things that get in the way for us to connect on structural levels, right? And so what are the things that we can do to go into more community spaces? If we're in positions of power, how do we create more opportunities for people to connect? Right. And so I told you I work with patients and students. One of the things that I do with my patients a lot is we create peer support groups. Right. Like, how do we make this work less individual so that you can feel like your experiences are normalized? When I work with my students, I try to do a lot of work that requires them to connect with those around them so that the classroom feels like a community space and not just a space they come in individually and learn and then leave, especially when there's not a lot of spaces where people feel that built in. And then are there things that you can start to target barriers to connection? So one thing that was really important to me before I came to Duke, I was at Ohio State. And Ohio State is massive for anybody who's familiar with the school. And we had our Black Graduate Caucus. So I did my graduate work at Ohio State. And it made the school feel so much more intimate to have a space where I could find other Black grad students, because most of us were the only ones in our program. So not only were we challenging a barrier to connection, we were challenging a systemic barrier of inequity that a lot of us felt othered. And so being able to come together was like, oh, you all get it too. And it was one way to challenge barriers to connection that are more pervasive and on a system level. And then last but not least, professional support, right? So sometimes it's not enough to do these things. There's something else that's there that's causing a barrier or resistance, and you might need more help. And that's okay, right? There are ways in which therapy and other forms of help can really support people when the loneliness is seeped in at a higher level, right? And so that's another avenue for, like, if loneliness is something that's much more deeper rooted, how do we also get support and help so that we can start to think through on a more deeper level how to create a social connection when we know it's something that's immensely powerful and important. So that being said, I want to give you all one takeaway, and then I want to make space for any questions that might come up. All right. So the question for all of you is, what is one way you can intentionally cultivate connection this week? And I'll tell you, the science says that if you write it down, you're more likely to do it. But also, if you share it, you're more likely to do it. So that being said, if anybody wants to share, what is one way you can intentionally cultivate connection this week? We are all ears, and we know that'll help all of us be more accountable. So what are some things that you all think that stood out to you that you could do this week to cultivate intentionally connection with others? Feel free to drop in the chat or come off mute. Okay. Yep. The eye contact and smile is easy to implement. It is, and fun. Yeah. Yeah. Send Valentine's to distant friends. St. Jude's Children's Hospital also has a way for you to send electronic Valentine's cards. Yeah. Asking deeper questions that cultivate more meaningful and deeper connections and conversations. Reach out to someone you haven't seen in a while. Going to church this Sunday. Yeah. Doing something you enjoy, like running. So running together with people. Okay. Reaching out and offering help. That's a beautiful way to do that. Yeah. Working together. A lot of people work from home. So let's work in the same space. I love all of these things. Call relatives, do something different. Starting a book club. Can I join? Going to a group fitness class. That's great. Yeah. We love a meal train to parents of a brand new baby because it makes you feel good and it also helps you to connect with somebody who probably is feeling very disconnected from themselves and others. Yeah. These are fantastic. And so what I'll tell you is, even if you don't put something in the chat, send it, let somebody know that that's something you're planning to do, because that also increases the chances that we'll do these things. Right. And another way to help us intentionally commit to something is planning when we'll do it. Right. We want to make our goals reasonable, feasible, and achievable. And so if I say I'm going to call somebody, what day would be the best to call them? So you're more likely to do it. And it goes beyond this moment where we're all feeling really motivated to connect. Right. But we want to figure out, how do we keep that momentum going? And I'm hoping that some of what you all shared will be good, kind of good ideas for other people if you're trying to come up with things. These are really, really good options. All right. And so I want to make sure I make space for questions, because I did see that there were some in the chat. But first, I want to thank you all Thank you so much for having me. This is a super important and timely topic, and I'm grateful and honored to be able to share in this space. And thank you all for your engagement and for your participation. It means the world to me, and I'm really happy that from 12 to 1, this is how I got to spend my time. So thank you all again. And with that, I want to make sure I open up the space for any questions and anything that came up where maybe you wanted me to dive a little deeper.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Brownlow. That was such a wonderful talk and so many wonderful questions coming up in the chat and just ideas for connections that folks are highlighting, which is wonderful. So I've taken note of some of the questions that are in the Q&A, and I see we have a hand raised from Cannon. So do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes. So thank you for a wonderful presentation. One of the things that I was interested in, you talked about some ethnic groups feeling more lonely. And something that I've always thought about is now we have significant immigrant populations where they don't necessarily speak English, whether you think in terms of a faction of Chinese older adults, seniors, or now with South Asians, Indians, and others. Has there been any study in terms of how loneliness impacts these types of communities?
Yeah, fantastic question. And I appreciate you raising that. Because, yes, there has been work that has looked at, particularly for immigration populations, there's kind of this tension of like assimilation and acculturation, but also like navigating multiple worlds of sorts. It kind of relates to that code switching and that kind of having to be different people. And that in of itself creates disconnection, right? Particularly for even where we see for it's actually those first generation immigrants who actually have more mental health related concerns because they're kind of having to balance the two worlds of sorts. And then it's particularly for those who speak multiple languages, there's even that disconnection too of like all the ways in which I have to kind of be translating literally. And that can also sever connection, especially when there aren't a lot of times built-in communities. And even when you are in those built-in communities, it often feels like they're straddling. And so we know for communities of color in particular, that is a big facet for loneliness. And then you're also at times met with stigmatization or marginalization or discrimination. And all those factors can compound the ways in which people feel internally isolated, but also externally isolated. So fantastic question. And yes, there is work being done in that space because we know that the ripple effect is health outcomes.
Exactly.
We also see health disparities. So this has direct links to that as well.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you.
One thing that I'll just take the moderator's prerogative and ask a quick question. One thing that I just so appreciate the research that's come out over the past 10 or 20 years, really highlighting the significant physical and mental health impacts that loneliness and particularly social disconnection can have for folks in the raising up of loneliness and social connection as a public health priority. One thing I find that can be kind of a challenge in talking about this, especially with sort of general population folks, is the sort of dichotomy between loneliness being a normative experience and something that everybody experiences from time to time and actually has an important signal function for us to kind of cue us that, we need to reach out and connect with others and all these strategies that you've suggested. It's really when we kind of withdraw and don't reach out and connect that loneliness can kind of become chronic and severe and lead to those negative consequences down the road. So just curious about how you think about balancing the kind of acknowledging the normative aspect and that loneliness is a very kind of useful and normal emotion. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have all those negative impacts while at the same time really acknowledging the real and significant health burden that it can bring.
Yeah. I love this question. And I saw some questions that might be similar to this too about, something that's happened as we've become more engaged around our emotions and mental health is that we sometimes pathologize normal behavior, right? And normal experiences. And so all of us are going to be lonely at some point, and that's not inherently a bad thing. And so there are ways in which there is a spectrum of when does loneliness become a problem? And that's, like anything, like when does sadness become a problem? When does anger become a problem? A lot of it is when it becomes debilitating and impairs functioning and it's pervasive, right? The intensity of it is getting to a point where it's actually getting in the way of your ability to function or your distress levels are getting significant. significant in certain ways. And so just feeling lonely in and of itself as an emotion, loneliness, the function of it is to serve as a cue for connection, to get curious around the ways that you are feeling disconnected. And so it's actually meant to trigger curiosity, right? Like, I feel really disconnected right now. And when I explore that, that allows me to potentially connect, right? It can be momentum for connection, or it can be a way to say, like, I don't feel connected here. I don't feel well aligned here. If I'm like, for those who maybe are like feeling lonely in relationships or lonely in certain settings, a part of what loneliness is telling you is there's something here that's not values aligned. There's something here that's not really tapping into the things that are important to me, right? And it can be a signal for your values. Where it becomes detrimental is where we're starting to see more of that mental health impact, right? Where it's not just that I'm lonely, but it's impacting my sense of self-worth. It's impacting my ability to move through my life, to engage with work. It's impacting how I show up in relationships. Or it's one of those things where it's a ripple effect. So I work with a lot of people in the hospital where what they're in the hospital for is one thing, but their lack of social support is now the new problem. And so maybe it wasn't loneliness that was their problem, but it's exacerbating existing problems. So that's another way to kind of differentiate between how do we think about like normative loneliness versus loneliness as a pathology.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of folks in the chat really resonated with your slide and discussion of kind of the masks that folks have to wear in different contexts, particularly folks who are marginalized, whose identities are less well represented and affirmed in the different spaces that they're in. I think Zavera raised a really good question about like, what are the ways that we as community members can build supportive spaces that can combat loneliness despite these forces that are contributing to folks not being able to feel like they can bring their full selves to particular contexts. What can folks in those contexts do to make them more supportive for everyone?
Yeah, beautiful question. And it's probably where most of my research lives. So in thinking about one of the burdens of navigating with the marginalized identity is that you have additive stress that now you have to require additive resources to navigate. And so some of what we can do is if we can cultivate spaces where people don't have to police or perform or put on a mask, it is literally good for our health to express our emotions and to do so freely. And it's oftentimes literally not safe. And so on the one hand, we can actually cultivate those spaces, but on the other hand, we can be walking safe spaces, right? How do I signal safety? How do I allow people to show up in their full humanity without judgment, without resistance, right? So that for a little bit, they can take off that extra weight, right? And that's something that we can do like on a micro level and a macro level, right? And particularly, again, if you're in positions of power, how do you create those spaces within the systems that you work in, right? And cultivate that kind of connection. Like even here at Duke, I'm a part of a program called Advance Up, and it's targeted towards underrepresented people in academia and in healthcare. And we get to come together, and for a little bit, we get to take off our mask and be in community and camaraderie and experience that collective exhale, right? And so we can all kind of figure out ways to create that in ourselves, but also within the things that we do. I think I saw a question too. I'm like looking through the chat.
I know there's so many great ones. And I see Kevin has a hand up, so maybe we have time for one more quick question, Kevin. If you can.
Sure. Thank you so much for this. My question I asked, I'm a pastor, and we have identified part of our mission as connecting isolated people. One of the great challenges is that all of the things that you've said as far as combating loneliness, people that are aware are doing that. The question is how to get to the people who are actually isolated and lonely so that they can have, and I mean, there's the additional challenge for us as with declining religiosity today as well, right? So it's how to create spaces and also be outside of our own building in spaces so that people who are feeling that marginalization, so people who are isolated, can find that connection. So I just wonder any advice you might have for someone leading an institution like that.
Yeah. And I might try to bridge this with another question that I saw that kind of related to like, I think it was about mothers, but also just any population where you notice that you're stretched and you're more likely to feel isolated and disconnected from others. And I think some of that is that, right? Like identifying people who are at greatest risk of feeling disconnected, whether because of like an identity that marginalizes them, whether because they're in a parent role, right, where they're often focused on other people, whether it's the busy leader, like who are the people who are most vulnerable? And some of it is, if we can do this on a more day-to-day level, we'll connect with the people who are isolated, right? So a part of that, how do I see the humanity in other people, means that even if I don't have to go out and find the person who's isolated, if I just make eye contact and smile with somebody, chances are I probably found somebody who felt isolated, right? If I speak to people and ask more deep questions, I might learn more information, right? If I pay more attention to the people who seem like they're on the outskirts, who are on literally the margins, those are the kinds of things that when I become less internally focused and more externally focused, I can pick up on. So there are specific populations that we see, but there are also ways in which we can navigate such that it creates opportunity for more connection so that we can identify the people who are most at need, and then feel more comfortable identifying themselves. Right? But a lot of it is like we have to go outside of our own spaces. And sometimes that means outside of our own comfort zones. Yeah. And I know we're at time too.
Yeah,
No.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Brownlow. That's a beautiful note to end on, just recognizing the humanity in others that we're encountering in our day-to-day lives and also in ourselves, and not getting kind of disconnected from that as well. So thank you so much for a great session. Thank you everyone for joining today.